From Caligula to Genghis Khan, all the way up to Hitler, history is full of these men that committed terrible acts of violence. Men that had a desire for power that led them to do terrible and unspeakable things. But over the centuries, if we look back, over time we can see a trend where these tyrants have less and less influence on the world stage. When all was said and done, it's estimated that the Mongols reduced the entire population of the earth by 11%. Hitler, on the other hand, had a much larger army at his disposal, but he wasn't nearly as effective, and he had to conceal the monstrosities that he was responsible for behind the walls of his concentration camps. You see, as far as I'm concerned, as time goes on, we've become increasingly more sophisticated at identifying these bad actors and extinguishing those early signs of genocidal tendencies before they're really able to take hold on a broader scale. We're not perfect, but we're getting better and better century after century. But as we get more and more effective at stamping out these tyrannical male figures, what happens when we go too far and we begin to suppress masculinity itself? In a culture that's increasingly less and less tolerant of men, and where acting like a man is no longer acceptable, what happens when that masculinity is forced below the surface? Well, the results are on full display in the recent school shootings here in America. These antisocial, unassuming, seemingly harmless boys are creating devastation and destruction in our country at an unprecedented rate. And it may seem like these shootings are new and we don't know why they're happening or what to expect, but Dostoevsky warned us about the danger of these weak men back in 1864 in his book, Notes from Underground. The book takes the form of a monologue by a character known as the Underground Man, and he starts out with a confession. "I am a sick man. I am a wicked man." So, who is this guy? He's a retired civil servant. He's in his 40s, and he's isolated himself from society and retreated into a state that he calls the underground. The underground is this manic, antisocial world of his own making, where he's the arbiter of truth and the outside world, other people, are just an inconvenience to him. He's smart, he's educated, and that makes him arrogant and self-aggrandizing, but at the same time, it also makes him cynical and really self-critical. He refers to himself as a spiteful mouse, and it's that disgust that he feels for himself and for his own character that drives his whole worldview. This imbalance in his character, the disgust and the self-loathing, mixed with the arrogance and resentment, all come together to create an unstable relationship between his inner world versus reality. And that makes him the perfect case study for understanding what goes on in the mind of these weak and warped young men that end up shooting innocent people. And there are 3 lessons that we can learn from this underground man. First, there's this intersectional fallacy that's rampant in identity politics today. The idea that we can define oppression based on a matrix that takes into account your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, all in an effort to rank order humanity on a scale of the oppressed and the oppressors, the haves and the have-nots. But the metrics of intersectionality turn out to be pretty crude if you look a little deeper. For example, let's make an intersectional matrix of the underground man. He's white, he's male, he's straight, he's a born and bred Russian citizen, he's highly educated, and he's not rich, but he's not lower class either. He resents the fact that he's not wealthy, but that's his problem. He's financially pretty stable. So he checks all the boxes of privilege. But those measures are all shallow, and they don't even begin to scratch the surface of the quality of the person that we're talking about here. Sure, he's educated and he's financially stable, but he's alone. He doesn't have any friends, no girlfriend, no wife, no children. He's middle-aged and he's got no meaningful relationships in his life. And what about the way he looks? He's unattractive, and you could imagine he's probably suffering from poor nutrition, lack of sleep, lack of exercise, all of these crucial details that get overlooked when we talk about the categories that make up a human being. And what about a broken home? It turns out that fatherlessness is actually a major contributor to negative outcomes in life. 70% of high school dropouts come from a fatherless home. 85% of youths in prison come from a fatherless home. The list goes on, from substance abuse, income earnings, and guess what? Almost every school shooter in U.S. history was raised in a fatherless home. Should we weigh that factor on the intersectional scale? And how do you think it makes these kids feel who are struggling every day of their lives just to get by, to be told that they're privileged and they're responsible for the suffering that goes on in the world? One of the things that Dostoevsky's story teaches us is that the underground is a real place. And that brings us to number 2. These kids are being driven out of the social sphere and into the underground with the reprehensible theories of inherited guilt. And they're finding relief by escaping the world of atoms and retreating into the digital space. The underground man is like the avatar of that type of person that lives online in Reddit forums, QAnon. His desire to escape the real world and retreat into himself would have been even more extreme today with the internet, where you have this unmitigated license to pursue whatever reality your mind desires. In the book, he says, "What do I care about the laws of nature if for some reason these laws and 2 times 2 is 4 is not to my liking?" And that contempt that he has for reality is actually the same force that's driving these kids into the digital space, where they're not bound by the laws of physics anymore, and they can shape and mold their entire reality in whatever way they choose. When my daughter was younger, her and I used to wrestle all the time. She loved it, and it was great for all sorts of reasons. For one thing, it developed a sense of trust between her and I. She understood that she could engage in this competitive back and forth with a male figure, and she was safe. You know, I wasn't trying to hurt her. It was play in the realest sense. And the other thing that it did was it helped her to discover the boundaries of her own aggression. I always let her hit and slap, she didn't hold back, that's for sure. But if she tried to go for the eyes or something like that, I'd stop her and I'd let her know, no. I'd tell her, hey, that's too far. You see, she had to learn her physical limitations. And kids, they need to realize that their actions have consequences, and the internet separates them from those consequences. And they get this skewed perception of how to navigate life. And that faulty navigation system can make its way into the real world if they don't meet any resistance. One of the main things about the underground man is that he thinks so highly of himself in this insulated world that he's built around him, but he hates the idea of sharing his thoughts with others because he can't stand the idea of being rejected and criticized. And it's that absence of resistance, the absence of positive masculine values, that really gets to the heart of the issue. Given that most of these school shooters are coming from fatherless homes, if masculinity is so toxic, then why are these terrible events breeding in its absence? The fact is, rejecting masculinity at a cultural level doesn't solve the problem, it amplifies it. Today, being weak and harmless can be touted as almost a badge of honor, and it's raised up as being this type of virtue. And that's how the underground man sees it. He says in the book, if I wanted to take revenge on someone who offended me, I wouldn't be able to take revenge on them anyway, because I surely wouldn't dare to do anything, even if I could. And he goes on to talk about how it's foolish for people to defend themselves. And as far as he's concerned, it's better to be a mouse than to be a man. He'd rather curl up in his hole than do something as pointless as learning how to be physically capable. But being weak and incapable doesn't make you good. And when you don't have a sense of confidence and respect for yourself, there's a part of you that still desires it, and it wants to demand that respect from other people, even when it's not warranted. After he talks about the virtues of being a mouse, the underground man says, I'll demand to be respected and I'll persecute whoever doesn't show me respect. See, having that inner strength breeds the confidence that you have nothing to prove because you can back yourself up if you need to. So you're not going through life in this anxiety-driven, fearful condition, but weakness eats away at you and it festers in your soul. And instead of going through life with this idea that I've got nothing to prove, you start believing that you have nothing to lose. If we're not teaching young boys, and young girls for that matter, how to understand these feelings and how to control them, how to engage with challenges and overcome them, they're forced out of the picture, out of the conversation, and it's not under their control anymore. And make no doubt, it doesn't make those problems disappear. They're gonna pop up later in the form of these terrible events. Dostoevsky's character finishes his manifesto by closing with this statement: "It's a burden for us even to be men with real, our own bodies and blood. We're ashamed of it. We consider it a disgrace, and we keep trying to be some unprecedented omni-men. We're stillborn and have long ceased to be born of living fathers. And we like this more and more. We are acquiring a taste for it." Finally, there's one more thing that stood out to me about this book. The underground man writes a story called Apropos of the Wet Snow. And it's a recollection of a painful memory that's been gnawing away at him for 20 years. But he's writing all this down because he hopes that it's going to give him some form of relief. Sometimes getting your thoughts down on paper or talking to somebody can completely change the way you feel about something. It's literally like a weight is lifted off of your shoulders. And if you're watching this and you feel like you're in a dark place and you're resentful and you're having thoughts about harming yourself or harming others, break the pattern. Talk to someone, reach out to someone and talk it out, because you might feel like you're underground right now. You might feel like you're being buried alive, and the only option is to end everything and drag everybody else down with you as you go. But there is a way out. There's always a way out into the light. And if you want to understand how our culture ended up here in the first place, you might like this video that I made about Dostoevsky's book, The Idiot. Please like the video and leave a comment if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you feel compelled to do so. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you next time.